Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, August 19th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, one taxpayer's effort to solve an IRS problem led to a much larger question about how the agency is functioning today. Plus, questions about institutional capacity aren't new. Some of the federal government's oldest obligations have long faced a gap between commitment and execution. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. President Trump has signed a new order to unleash the private sector to conduct offensive cyber operations. The goal is to go after foreign criminal hackers like ransomware gangs. But the new program also comes with questions about legal liabilities and other risks for companies that participate. Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now with more details. Justin, great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
This is a fascinating question here. How does this new memo get private companies involved in offensive cyber ops?
Yeah, it's interesting. It establishes a government-run program that will contract with private sector companies and approve any offensive cyber operations conducted by those industry participants. And it's squarely aimed at foreign cyber criminal groups, not importantly, foreign nation state hackers who are associated with a foreign government, and certainly nothing focused domestically, but we'll get into some of the complications there later on. However, this is going to put the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security in kind of co-lead roles here. Each will designate a program executive director to oversee the program. That program will approve any cyber operations, and then they will supervise kind of the results of those cyber operations. And this is something that the Trump administration had been foreshadowing as part of its national cyber strategy, talking about unleashing the private sector to take on adversary networks and scale national capabilities. And experts I spoke to kind of pointed to how the private sector has access to a lot of talent, a lot of resources in this space, and they don't necessarily have the same constraints that government has when it comes to being able to access different types of cybersecurity data that might be relevant to going after cyber criminals who are hacking into American companies.
Is that the main argument for putting this in the private sector, that they have more talent and fewer constraints?
Those are certainly two of the biggest arguments here. Of course, the government itself has a lot of cyber talent. It's kind of had the exclusive arena in the United States when it comes to offensive cyber operations by law up to this point. And so the National Security Agency, the FBI, of course, and other agencies still have a lot of talent. But in addition to, a lot of former officials going to industry and bringing that kind of unique know-how with them, the private sector also has telemetry and is able to set up commercial, agreements with other companies that have data that the government would need a warrant to go and get in cyberspace. And so it's interesting to kind of think through the different types of targets that the private sector might more readily have access to data on. It's a lot of notional talk around how exactly this is going to work right now, but that's kind of what this whole memo is aimed at, is taking advantage of some of those unique capabilities within the private sector.
This seems like a pretty tricky space for private sector companies to navigate. What are some of the big questions that they will have about getting involved in this kind of program?
Yeah, the legality of this type of program is certainly a big question, because while obviously this is coming from the president, this is coming from the White House, it's kind of putting all of these operations squarely within the authorities of the Department of Homeland Security and the Justice Department, who do have authorities to, of course, go after foreign criminal hackers and to conduct shutdown operations and things like that. Bringing in the private sector and having them kind of formulate these operations and have them, be involved so closely in some of these offensive hacking operations is really raising a lot of questions about, how are foreign governments going to view this? If they're swept up in this somehow, if some digital piece of infrastructure is swept up in some of these operations, certainly foreign adversaries like China and Russia, will they view companies as more legitimate targets if they're going after criminal groups that are adjacent to these governments? And then just the fact that hacking is still by and large illegal under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and other laws. And how is the government going to address that? The memo doesn't squarely kind of address those questions. So I spoke to Lynn Brown. She's a former attorney at the FBI and currently at the law firm Wiley Rein. And she spoke about how these contractual agreements that DHS and DOJ will strike with these companies, the details of those contractual agreements will be key.
I would hope that there will be robust dialogue so that the private sector can articulate to the government what it is that they're seeking in terms of potential liability protection or indemnification, et cetera. With the government's probable desire to have some kind of standardized template agreements for efficiency's sake and for uniformity's sake.
So, Justin, as we move forward in this, how are the government agencies actually getting organized to oversee this program?
Yeah, it's interesting. DHS and DOJ, as I mentioned, will be the co-leaders of this program. But the way this will be overseen on a day-to-day basis is through something called the National Coordination Center. Now, this is a relatively new government entity that was established under a immigration-focused executive order that Trump signed back on his first day in office, January 20th, 2025. The National Coordination Center under that EO was set up to coordinate the activities of federal Homeland Security task forces. And again, that was largely viewed kind of from an immigration lens, but DHS and DOJ, of course, have tasks there. And it'll be interesting to see how the personnel and how the resourcing and how all that works. We don't know a whole lot about this National Coordination Center, given that it's such a new entity. I spoke with Tanya Ugoretz, who is a former senior FBI official, former senior intelligence official who oversaw kind of the establishment of some cyber organizations when she was in government over the last 2 decades. She's now with PwC's Cyber and Risk Innovation Institute. And she spoke about how whenever one of these new kind of government coordination centers pops up, there's a lot of questions about how it's resourced and staffed.
When you're standing up entities like that in the government, you're often not adding net new personnel and expertise. You're borrowing and pulling from the limited resources and expertise that already exists in various government agencies. So it's a really careful balance to create a central coordinating entity and ensure it has the right people and areas of expertise that you need, while also ensuring that the agencies they're inevitably reaching back to, who will have a voice in this coordination, remain sufficiently staffed.
Again, that's Tanya Ugoretz, former senior FBI cyber official. And so we'll be watching to really see how the details of this new memo and this new program, novel program, play out.
That's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for this story.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, one taxpayer's effort to solve an IRS problem led to a much larger question about how the agency is functioning today. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A routine IRS problem sent reporter Stephanie Mensimer looking for answers. What she found was a growing concern among tax practitioners, taxpayer advocates, and former agency officials about how the agency is functioning. Stephanie joins me now to share her experience and her findings. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You have written an article about the IRS, and it starts with your own effort to resolve what should have been a relatively routine IRS issue. But as you reported it out, you found similar experiences from tax practitioners and advocates and IRS officials. What really persuaded you that your experience was just the symptom of something much bigger?
Well, I had actually written a story about the IRS a year ago. I'm from Ogden, Utah, and the IRS has a giant service center in Ogden. And so, everyone in Ogden at some point seems to have worked there at some point. So I was out there during the big cuts, the big staffing cuts. So I was aware that they had cut very fast and had cut all sorts of people, everybody from the mailroom on up. And I think they had, by the time I ran into my troubles with them, they had cut 30% of the workforce, basically. And I think when I started having problems, I thought, oh, this is what everyone warned me about last year, that the IRS couldn't function like this, and they can't lose a third of their staff and think they're going to be able to still process all of the work that they do.
The IRS customer service and effectiveness has been the butt of jokes for decades, I think. What evidence did you find that conditions today are really different from what have been historical challenges for them?
Well, the IRS's own data shows that they are having trouble answering the phone. They aren't answering the mail. They have backlogs that are recent. I think during COVID, a lot of the mail piled up at the IRS. And so they did have a lot of unanswered mail unprocessed, like amended returns. But the Biden administration put money into the Inflation Reduction Act to try to shore up the IRS. And they had hired a lot of people in 2024, 2023 to try to help, get a handle on these things and improve customer service. And so things were getting better. They were trending. All the data was saying, they were answering more calls, the backlogs were going down. And then Trump came into office in January 2025, and all of that just ground to a halt and reversed itself. And the data that I looked at from various places, the Treasury Inspector General, the IRS's, the Taxpayer Advocate Service, all the data showed that everything was getting worse, that some tiny percentage of the calls that they get were actually being answered. And the mail backlog had gone from like 3 million pieces of mail to 7 million in just 1 year. So my experience just was supported by all that data.
Stephanie, much of your reporting focuses on workforce reductions, and yet we've had senior officials say this was the best tax filing season ever. When you consider the experiences that you've documented with those kinds of public statements, how do you reconcile the difference?
Well, I think that the IRS actually deployed a lot of people to answer the phone and to take some of those functions during tax season, like just in the run up to April 15th. And, they took people from all over the place. They wiped out 40% of the IT department at the IRS. But the people who are left, they redeployed those people to answer the phones during tax filing season. So I think they made a big push to try to get people, during that window of when everybody's filing their taxes to make things work a little better. But as a lot of the tax practitioners told me, the real test of how the IRS is functioning comes like on April 16th, like the day after. And that's what happened to me. Like I got a letter about a month or two after my taxes had been filed saying, there's been an error, or we've corrected your return. And so that's what happens when all of these people start getting these notices. And now that's where the staffing cuts are really showing up, I think, is that there's just nobody there to address these more complicated problems or to deal with some stuff that's, I think it's kind of automated. There's a fair amount of automated stuff that comes out of the IRS. And so that seems to chug along. But like, if you're a taxpayer and you get one of these letters, you need to respond to them. You need to call and say, wait, this is wrong, or, oh, I need a payment plan, or whatever. And those calls just are not getting answered. I've spent hours and hours and hours on the phone with the IRS, and half the time I've been disconnected. And that's sometimes after sitting on hold for 2 hours, or sometimes they don't even let you stay on hold because the phone lines are overwhelmed. And I talked to a number of lawyers who work in low-income tax clinics, and, they help people try to resolve their issues with the IRS. They can't get through. There's a special line for, lines for tax practitioners that's supposed to help them be able to reach somebody. they can't reach anybody. When they do reach someone, they say that, these people don't know anything. And then they ask for a manager, but there's no managers. They never get manager callbacks. So, everybody I talked to had horror stories about trying to reach the IRS. And a lot of these people, like one guy I talked to had been doing tax law and pro bono representation of low-income taxpayers for like 50 years. He said, I'd never seen it this bad.
Stephanie Mensimer is a senior reporter with Mother Jones. Stephanie, let's follow up on that last comment that you made, because a lot of times when we think about customer experience with the IRS, we think about the taxpayer, and certainly that's important. But there are taxpayer advocates, there are law enforcement agencies, there are attorneys for all kinds of organizations that want to reach folks at the IRS. And the senior leaders there have said automation is going to help us, AI is going to help us. But you're addressing a really fundamental human-to-human connection here. What are we thinking about in terms of customer experience? Who gets that? Who's responsible for it? What do you see as the future there?
Well, I think the IRS has even realized that they have cut to the bone, and they have been trying to hire people back. But, because of the way they did it, the way they just slashed through the workforce, nobody wants to go back there, because the one huge benefit of working for the government is the stability historically. You might not get paid as much in some certain parts of the private sector, or as you would in the private sector, but it's usually stable. And the Trump administration just upended all of that. And so they won't hire back the people they fired. So I think that's part of the issue. And, they have closed the window to a lot of in-person types of opportunities. Like during the Biden administration, they used that extra money from Congress to open in-person taxpayer assistance centers, which existed before, but a lot of them had been shut down or they weren't fully staffed. And Biden, I think, managed to get it to the point. There are like more than 100 of these that were fully staffed. So people who aren't good with technology, or maybe their first language isn't English, or they're just an elderly person and they can't make the scanner work, whatever, like you can go in person and get help with your tax issues. And since Trump took office, the number of those places has fallen from like 100, more than 100, to about 40. And so as I discovered, I thought maybe I'd go to one, maybe because I couldn't get anyone on the phone. I thought, I'll go to this place and they could help me and I'll just take all my paperwork. But you actually need an appointment usually to go there. And the only way to make an appointment with one of these places is to call the IRS. And I could never get through on the phones. And so I think that, there's a whole segment of the population that, people, as I mentioned in my story, a lot of people, low-income people, are very vulnerable to fraud by dodgy tax preparers, people who promise them, we can get you these big refunds. And it turns out they're not really eligible for them. And so they often find out very late in the game that they owe the government a bunch of money. And so they need to be able to, get a payment plan or to address these issues. And they just can't. And, the risks of not responding to the IRS are quite high. Ultimately they can take your house, they can take your bank account, they have a lot of power to come and take the money they think that you owe. And if you can't get through, you're going to be in big trouble. And these things can have, repercussions for years to come.
Stephanie, let's take politics out of this conversation. We haven't really touched on it now, but I don't want a political answer to this next question either. The IRS fundamentally exists to generate the money to operate the government, right? That's what it's about. It's about money in and money out. And most Americans actually want to pay their taxes, right? That nobody wants to be a tax dodge. So when you think about how the IRS and the Trump administration are approaching just the basic responsibilities here, got to collect money in, got to put money out. What do you think is the management philosophy at work behind all of these changes?
That's a really good question, because I don't know that there is one. It's really short-sighted. I think that the people have people misunderstand how the IRS functions and what it does, and how competent a lot of the civil service really is. And it's a huge and unwieldy system, 330 million people covered through the IRS. And that I think there are these ideas that there's an easy technological fix for a lot of what the IRS does. And that's just not true. They were doing some fixes actually, a couple of years ago and trying to fix them, make some of these things work better. And, when you fire 40% of the IT department, that just can't happen. So I don't know what the management strategy is there. It doesn't seem to really come from anything. It's like nihilism, like this idea that government is bad. And, there are people who philosophically think that taxation is theft. And I think there are wealthy people who really hate the IRS and don't want to have to pay taxes. And they're the ones who often push to dismantle the parts of the enforcement system that would, take a chunk out of their income. And so there are a lot of, the IRS has a lot of enemies. Even though, it's so central to democracy. I'd read somewhere a long time ago that I think it was Nelson Mandela, when he first became president of opposed apartheid South Africa, one of the first things he did was to create a really functioning revenue service, because he realized that you can't have a functioning democracy if your government can't work for people and, to put your agenda across and to work on things like equality and raising the standard of living for your residents. It's all part of a fair and equitable tax administration, and people forget about that.
Stephanie Mensimer is senior reporter with Mother Jones. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining me and for telling us this story today.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the Postal Service has long delivered ballots. Increasingly, policymakers wanted to play a larger role in how ballots are validated and counted. But first, questions about institutional capacity aren't new. Some of the federal government's oldest obligations have long faced a gap between commitment and execution. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The IRS may be today's headline example of an institution struggling to match resources to mission, but the challenge is hardly new. The federal government's obligations to tribal nations date back to the country's founding, and a new Brookings report examines why the systems supporting those commitments continue to fall short. Here to share more details is Brookings Institution Fellow Rob Maxim. Rob, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. It's great to be with you.
Brookings has just put out a new report quantifying the continued underinvestment by federal government and philanthropy into Indian country. And one of the ways the report frames this is an obligation, that the nation has an obligation to support tribal communities, not just a bunch of programs. Talk to me about why that distinction is so important.
Yeah, and we don't use that word just arbitrarily. That's a pretty recognized legal term. The idea of trust and treaty obligations by the United States to Indian country. And where that really comes from, so as I'm sure folks are aware from, their elementary or high school history classes, the U.S. signed well over 300 treaties with Native American nations. And so if you look at the Constitution of the United States, treaties are treated as the supreme law of the land, and that's inclusive of treaties signed with Native American tribes. And over the last, 250 years of our nation's history, these treaties have been affirmed and reaffirmed by courts as being the valid law of the land. And why this matters is tribes ceded what we now call the United States to the U.S. federal government and to the states. And as long as the U.S. continues to exist on that land, those treaties are valid and they're in force. And those treaties require the U.S. government to provide certain material benefits for tribes, tribal citizens, Native people, and Native communities in exchange for that land. And so what we're talking about here isn't funding based on race or DEI. It's not funding based on need. It's really it's a legal obligation that the U.S. government itself made in exchange for the land. And as long as the U.S. continues to be here, those obligations are in force.
And yet, despite the legal obligations, your report argues that federal investment in tribal communities still falls short, despite decades of studies and reports and recommendations. Why do we have so much trouble solving this problem?
I think it's largely a question of will. And so one of the reports that we quote in our work is by a group, the United South and Eastern Tribes. They're an organization that represents about 36 tribes in the south and eastern part of the United States. And they talk about the fact that the obligations that the U.S. has are debt-based. They're not based on need. So they must be paid in perpetuity despite how well or how not well Native people and Native tribes are doing economically and socially. At the same time, though, we know that many Native communities aren't doing well. And the U.S. government, as you've alluded to, has studied this over and over, and yet they continue to not take action. One of the most notable studies that we cite in the report was published in the 1970s by the U.S. American Indian Affairs Commission. And what they said is that as part of the trust obligation, the trust and treaty obligation that the U.S. has, it is incumbent on the United States to ensure that the standard of living for Native people meets that of the population of the U.S. as a whole. Well, as a lot of our recent work at Brookings has shown, that's definitely still not the case on many economic and social indicators. And so despite the fact that the U.S. government has known and published about this problem for 50 years, the way that we continue to perpetuate our systems of federal government funding continually results in these shortfalls for tribal communities. And again, that's a policy choice that we're making.
When people hear underinvestment, they probably think first off, maybe only of money.
Yeah.
And yet your report makes the point that there are many other issues here. Data problems, grant barriers, funding structures. What did you find maybe as the biggest obstacle beyond will to actually meeting our obligations?
The way that the federal government goes about its annual funding process, this discretionary funding process, and a lot of your listeners, especially those that work in the federal government, are probably familiar with it, right? Every year the president submits a budget, and then recently Congress tends to ignore that budget and create their own, and then they'll pass some top-line funding levels, and then if we're lucky, they pass an appropriations bill on time and we don't have a government shutdown. That has not been the case in recent years, but if we're lucky, that's what happens. The challenge that comes from that for Indian country is in order to avoid those shutdowns, the federal government likes to just hold funding levels steady each year and keep passing the same bill with either the same level of funding or some sort of de minimis increase. Well, for Indian country, that results in an effective funding cut because of inflation. It does for many communities, but for tribal communities in particular, when we're thinking about the obligations that the U.S. government has, if we're just holding funding steady every year, that means two things. The first, it means real funding is decreasing as inflation happens. But also, if these programs run out of money, then Native people can't access the programs and benefits that are designed for them to meet these obligations. And that's a real concern and a real challenge that tribal communities have had to contend with.
Rob Maxim is a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Rob, the funding issue is maybe the single most important one, but the paper also really calls out the issue with Native communities actually accessing that funding. Mm-hmm. What are the systems challenges there? What are the process challenges? And how can we improve their ability to access funding when it is available?
Yeah, so I don't want to be too repetitive, but a lot of it does come back to this scarcity that's created by discretionary funding. So when Congress only allocates a certain amount of money, it's not enough for every tribal community to access their full needs. And so what that means is federal agencies, when they receive funding from Congress, take two steps to implement that. The first is they'll often use competitive grants. So tribes will need to put forward applications for funding, and not everyone will receive it. And so what that means is funding goes toward those tribes that are either the largest or they have the most well-developed grant or federal government application capacity, and it disadvantages many smaller and less resourced tribes. So there's an unequal distribution of funding. The other challenge comes from the federal government. And again, anyone that's ever dealt as a contractor with the federal government is probably familiar with this, right? They use a reimbursement-based model. So you're expected to go out and spend your money, and then you get reimbursed by the federal government. It's called a drawdown. And so that can work fine for example, a large private sector company like a defense contractor or some sort of construction contractor that has a lot of capital on hand. But for a tribe, it's a small government, and it's really trying to make ends meet. And as we've discussed, many of these are less resourced. They may not have the capital on hand to be able to put out an expenditure and then ask for reimbursement. So even if there was enough funding, the way that these barriers go into place really prohibit tribes from accessing funding, even if it's available.
Separate then from the question of whether the United States is meeting its treaty obligations to tribes, the report also looks beyond Washington and finds that less than 1% of foundation and corporate philanthropy goes to Native-serving causes. Why hasn't philanthropy stepped into this gap more aggressively?
Yeah, and the reason we talk about the philanthropy side of things is because not only has there been historic underinvestment in Indian country, but right now, under the Trump administration, we're seeing some pretty intensive federal cuts. Our recent research looking at the One Big Beautiful Bill Act found that Indian country is likely to lose $1.5 billion from that bill being turned into law. So there's a real impetus right now for non-federal sources, including philanthropy, to step up. What we find, though, is really a series of barriers that have prevented them from doing so. So one of the biggest is many philanthropic organizations, foundations, corporate giving, just don't think about tribal communities. It's not, on their agenda, it's not on their radar, and it's not part of their giving. And they may not regularly interact with many Native folks or Native communities. And so they're not putting that as a priority when they think about who they want to invest in. We see a pretty small and narrow set of the same funders giving to Indian country every year, and there are efforts to expand that, but they've been slow going. Another challenge comes from just misunderstandings about Indian country. I think that on one hand, for example, giving to tribal communities has really been wrapped up in this anti-DEI backlash. And so Native communities have really been negatively impacted by that. In other instances, and we saw this in existing research, there are philanthropic leaders that think that, tribes already get a ton of federal funding, or they have a bunch of casino money, so they don't need philanthropic funding. But the reality is those are based on misconceptions of Indian country and absolutely aren't the default for most Native people in many places.
So if policymakers took only one lesson from your report, what's the change that would produce the biggest improvement in outcomes for tribal communities?
I think in terms of the biggest outcome, it would be shifting more money to mandatory funding. And let me give you an example of what we mean by that. So if you qualify for Medicare, for example, once you qualify, your medical expenses are covered at a certain threshold, and there's kind of no financial cap. If you have a major surgery, then that's going to be covered just as much as if you only visit your doctor once or twice a year. That's not the case, for example, with the Indian Health Service, which is granted a certain amount of funding. And when that funding runs out or runs low, the Indian Health Service needs to make the decision about what services it isn't going to offer or what people it's not going to be able to serve anymore. So there are many of these programs in Indian country that are set with a finite cap of funding. And if we change that to a more mandatory structure, akin to many of the programs that Americans are familiar with, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, then it would do a lot to ensure that more funding is available for tribal communities.
So, Rob, as we wrap up here, you made the case for this funding at the beginning when we talked about treaty obligations and national history. Make the case for national well-being. Why should we be engaged with the tribal communities at the level that this paper suggests?
Yeah, one of the things that our work and others has shown is that investment in tribal communities doesn't just benefit Native people, right? I mean, Native reservations border many non-Native communities. They serve as economic anchors. If you think about things like tribal colleges, they educate not just Native students, but non-Native students. Tribal enterprises employ a significant number of non-Native people in the U.S., and especially in rural areas, you see tribal governments are often the primary facilitator of many pieces of core infrastructure, physical infrastructure like roads, but also provision of health care, right? Think about back during the pandemic when, in many instances, the only places in the U.S. that had vaccines available were tribal governments early on. So there's all sorts of examples of when tribes are fully resourced and do well. There's spillovers for non-Native communities as well. But when it cuts the other way and tribes are under-resourced, it inhibits economic growth in the surrounding communities as well. So beyond just the legal obligation, it's a really good economic case to invest fully in tribal communities, because there would absolutely be positive economic and social spillovers for non-Native people as well.
Rob Maxim is a fellow at the Brookings Institution. Rob, thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks for this paper.
Thank you so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Up next, the Postal Service has long delivered ballots. Increasingly, policymakers want it to play a larger role in how those ballots are validated and counted. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Postal Service has traditionally served as neutral infrastructure during elections, moving ballots from voters to election officials. But changes in election law, postmark requirements, and voter verification debates are placing new demands on the agency. Elena Patel of the Brookings Institution joins me now to discuss what that shift could mean for the Postal Service and the election system. Elena, it is great to have you back on the show. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Terry.
You have got a new paper out that is so timely. A lot of people are starting to think about the midterms. Here we are in August. Ballots are getting printed. Early voting will start soon. And yet the post office of all organizations is in the center of the conversation. Talk to us about why the Postal Service has become such an important player in the ongoing debate over voting and election administration.
Yeah, I think the Postal Service, this is one of the areas in which it's really a quiet backbone of democracy. And I think people don't think a lot about the Postal Service, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. It does all of its work in the background, taking ballots from election administrators to the people who have requested their mail-in ballot, and then back again to be counted. And that's the role they've always done. They've always done it very well. I think the pandemic put a lot of pressure on the Postal Service really to rise to meet the challenge of the 2020 election and exactly what that environment was. And again, they rose to meet the challenge, and they helped in an administrative capacity our election system. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not a single election system as we're coming up to the midterm elections. It's actually 8,000 different jurisdictions that the Postal Service is helping each of them move their ballots through the system so that voters can vote in whatever way is permissible according to state rules.
And that's a really key point here. I think the Postal Service is a federal agency. Elections are run by states and counties. And across the country, there are very different approaches to mail-in ballots. Walk us through some of the data that you've seen.
Yeah, so in 2024, about 30% of people voted by mail. There's a ton of heterogeneity in who does that, though. And what I mean by that is that in certain states, mail-in ballots are automatically sent to every single voter. Utah is one of those states, a state where I used to live. And in those states where the ballots automatically go out, a lot of people choose, I would imagine for convenience reasons or whatever they might decide, to vote by mail. And so in those states, there are some states where 90% of people vote by mail, but it's because the ballots are mailed automatically. In other states, there are requirements. You might need to specify a reason why you need to vote by mail, and you can request the mail-in ballot. And that variation is a hallmark of our system, which is, as you've noted, the states and the localities decide the parameters of the elections for their citizens. And the Postal Service is just there to help them facilitate that process.
And your paper points to a recent Supreme Court ruling that has really increased the relevance of some postal practices in controlling elections. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court case that was recently decided about a month ago was whether it is legal for an election official to count a ballot that arrives after Election Day. And so it was really a question about what does Election Day mean and why might ballots arrive after Election Day? And how does that involve the Postal Service? Well, the Postal Service applies a postmark to most mail. It's that little stamp that gets stamped on your letter at the top that says this stamp has been used. You can't reuse it. It's really a processing mark, but it's a date that indicates affirmatively when the Postal Service received a piece of mail in the system. And elections, like many other legal processes, rely on that stamp to say this piece of mail entered a specific date, and therefore it's on time for whatever system is happening in the background. In the case of ballots, there are several states that say as long as you've postmarked your mail-in ballot by election day, it will be still counted as long as it arrives within 3, 5, 7 days after election. And so officials need to wait actually for all the mail-in ballots to come in before they can really finalize the vote count. And that was the legal question, whether it is permissible for election officials to count ballots that have been postmarked by election day but arrive later. And ultimately, that's what the Supreme Court decided, that that is a legal process that states can avail themselves of. Not all states do. This is a state process.
Elena Patel is co-director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center and a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. But Elena, this issue around the postmark is really crucial because it's now an essential date validation at a time when the Postal Service itself is cutting back its capacity to postmark mail.
That's right.
Budget
the
cuts.
Postal Service, yes, they're
capacity.
struggling.
Yeah.
They have a real business model problem right now, and they're asking Congress to help them ensure the Postal Service can stay the system that it has been for hundreds of years in the future, just like it has existed for hundreds of years. They are facing a cash flow shortage. They don't raise revenue by people mailing letters like they used to, because a lot of us have moved a lot of communication online, and they really need Congress to rethink their business model. And what that has to do with the postmark is that in order to improve efficiency in the system, everybody should be for that. We want an efficient postal operator, just like we want a universal postal operator. They've been changing the way mail moves through the system, consolidating processing at sort of like bigger spokes in the system. So mail travels a little bit further to run through the machines that, for example, stamp the mail to say the Postal Service has received it. So the Postal Service has let people know this. On Christmas Day, they said, hey, you might think that the stamp arrives as soon as you put it in the blue box and somebody picks it up, but that's not actually true. There might be a delay with some of the reconsolidation that we've done in the network. And so it might not be for a day or two after you've dropped your ballot or your mail piece that it gets a stamp. And the Postal Service has been very transparent about this. And they have said to voters, for example, if you need a date today when you drop your ballot, you can go to the counter and ask the mail clerk to hand cancel your mail with a stamp. So they are trying, as an administrator of election systems, like many other processes that they support, trying to help the public navigate the back-end business work that they're doing by reminding people you can, for example, hand cancel or stamp your mail. The problem is that not everybody has the time or ability or capacity to get to a post office and a retail counter during business hours to stamp their mail. And so, I think there are processes in place to help people get around the consolidation and the effect of that. It's not equally available to everybody. And so there are many people, I think, that are rightly questioning, why can't you hand cancel my mail in the post office as an administrator of systems to indicate that my mail piece arrived on time?
So that's one, and a really important point of intersection and perhaps disconnect between the responsibilities of the Postal Service in elections and its capacity to support them. The second I want to pull out a little bit is, the Trump administration's really been highly critical of mail voting. The president is advocating for the SAVE Act, focused on election integrity. And that can put potentially a whole new set of responsibilities on the Postal Service, not just to deliver the mail, but to decide who gets the mail. That seems a stretch. Tell us how that would function.
Yeah, this is really an unprecedented change that is being imposed by the administration through executive order. So as part of the pieces that go with the SAVE Act, what the president has required of the Postal Service is that they not only move the ballots through the system, but when ballots are mailed out, that they check every ballot against a nationally maintained eligible voter list and not deliver ballots for somebody who's not on the list that they've produced. And this is problematic for a whole variety of reasons. One, most fundamentally, it's taking the Postal Service out of this neutral administrator and putting it into a role that I describe as election bouncers. And I don't think we want our letter carriers to be in that position. It also really is transferring power from local election officials to the federal government in a way that I think is inconsistent with the way that we run our elections. They are maintained, the processes are maintained, the lists are generated by these local election officials. And this is really fundamentally moving that power to DC. And I think that is the legal question here. And it actually is something that the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to weigh in on. And one hopes that they weigh in on it quickly, because the longer the decision takes, the closer we get to the midterm elections, and then there'll be a process scramble for the Postal Service if they do, in fact, need to be doing this election bouncing work.
So I just want to, I guess, foot stomp or ask you to foot stomp again. That is back to a topic we talked about at the beginning, a conflict between the federal role in elections and the state role in elections. But regardless of how that sorts out, it's also just a pure capacity problem for the post office. What are the practical implications of that if the rule would go into effect?
At a time when the Postmaster General is now not making payments to retirement accounts to fund retirement benefits for postal retirees to preserve cash, any change in process costs money. I've not seen any estimate of how much this will cost, but it's a disruption in the work that the Postal Service does, and that's going to be costly. There's also a cost to the voters that is really important to keep in mind, which is that these lists that are produced, they have known flaws in them. So there is, for example, a study that showed that in a single county in Texas, 14% of the people flagged as non-eligible voters were actually eligible. And for that 14% of people in that county, that means that when the ballots get mailed out, theirs just get handed back to election officials. They never go out, even though they're supposed to be receiving a ballot. And that is some of the cost of taking what is a very complex process that states and localities, I think, work very hard to manage for the specification of their particular area and handing it to the federal government. We just don't have the federal systems in place to do this without error. And so now you're in the position of people not getting ballots who really were supposed to be getting ballots.
Your report does a great job of taking these concerns and building them out and talking about them in practical language that we can all kind of get our heads around. But speaking of getting their heads around, what are the policy issues that Congress needs to be thinking about now? We've got elections right on the horizon. We've got the big presidential election 2 years from now. None of these changes happen overnight. What do you want to see them take on from a policy or a resourcing perspective?
I think there's two concrete things that are worth Congress thinking about in the short run and the long run. The long run question is the thing that you and I have talked about before that I think anybody who pays attention to postal knows is an issue, which is we have not really revamped the Postal Service's funding model since it was created in 1971. And it's time. 2026 is a different era than 1971. The mail is different, and the Postal Service is national infrastructure. And so Congress really needs to decide what the Postal Service is doing on behalf of everybody in this country and fund them appropriately. In the short term, what I most worry about is this creeping between the postmark and the systems that rely on the postmark. And the Postal Service has changed its postmarking practice by postmarking at these consolidated facilities that are further away for business reasons. It's related to that long-term problem I told you. But I do think Congress should be asking the Postal Service to go back to retaining the cancellation of mail or postmarking at the local post offices, because elections, legal systems, appeals processes, all of these legal processes administratively rely on that postmark to indicate when mail was received. And that's what national infrastructure is. It is there to support all of our systems. And as these things pull apart, I think that Congress needs to push them back together.
Elena Patel is co-director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center and senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Elena, thank you so much for raising these issues for us today.
Thanks, Terry. It was great to talk to you.
We'll post this interview and a link to her paper at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Defense Department has begun using new strategic hiring committees to vet civilian employees. But nearly a year after the Trump administration ordered agencies to create them, there's still a lot we don't know about how they work. 4 committees now operate across the Pentagon and military departments, but DoD has provided few details about how many hires they review, how often they reject candidates, or whether they're actually slowing the hiring process. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen has been digging into what these committees are doing. She joins me now with more on what they could mean for the Pentagon's civilian workforce. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Terry.
Let's start at the beginning. What are these hiring committees, and why did the Trump administration want to create them in the first place?
So they were created under a Trump executive order last October as a way to give senior officials more control over civilian hiring across the federal government. So at DoD, there's now 4 committees, one for each of the military departments. So one for Army, one for Navy and the Marine Corps, and then another one for the Air Force and Space Force, and then one covering the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other defense agencies. So, DHA, Missile Defense Agency, so on and so forth. So they're supposed to make sure that hiring decisions line up with the administration's priorities, what the agency itself needs, and what DoD is calling merit-based practices and critical mission requirements.
What do we actually know about how they work and how they make those kinds of decisions? What kind of data do they collect?
So we're not entirely sure what kind of data they collect, and that's one of the issues here, right? DoD hasn't said how many hires have gone through these committees, how many candidates have been rejected, or, even exactly which types of jobs are subject to additional review. We know a little bit about how the Air Force's committee works. It meets every 2 to 4 weeks. It reviews individual hiring requests for exemptions from the hiring freeze, which has sort of thawed a little bit at this point, and the department's staffing plan overall. But, the Air Force still wouldn't say how many hires its committee has approved or denied, or what types of positions are being exempted.
The Pentagon has been pretty vocal about trying to reduce its hiring cycle time. How do these committees fit into that schedule? Do they just add time, or are they saving it somewhere else?
So the concern is anytime you add something, another layer of oversight in, right? Like that slows things down because there's more people that have to get involved and sign off on things. So, nobody would answer directly how it's affecting the timeline. The Army said they have put workarounds in place to avoid delays. So that, kind of indicates that there were delays that they needed to work around. The department hired more civilians in the first 6 months of 2026 than it did in the same period in 2025, right when the Trump administration came in, implemented the hiring freeze. But it's still not anywhere near the hiring levels, the Biden administration of other previous administrations. So, the civilian workforce overall is still shrinking. And there's anecdotal evidence floating out there that positions get stuck in these approval processes. So hiring's still going, but, it still appears that the committees can be creating bottlenecks.
Rachel, do we have any information on which particular hiring actions these committees are considering? Is it all grades, all skill sets? Is it just senior positions? Is it just critical skill set? What's actually within their purview?
That's one of the things I'm trying to find out. The assumption by, folks like those at the Partnership for Public Service and other smart people that are watching these play out, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on which agency you're looking at and the determinations that they're making for their own folks. But, I think for the higher up sort of SES kind of positions, maybe higher GS, their thought is these panels have, more involvement in that than they might, for kind of just the rank and file, program office sort of folks. But, I think that it depends on service by service. I think it probably depends on, the time that each of them have. Maybe it's a situation where they're, kind of batch approving, lower level folks and then giving higher level folks a little more consideration. But, we don't know. The information that's kind of out there so far is the people that they're paying the most attention to are the ones who are working on, the Trump administration's kind of higher priority efforts. So, things like space operations, Golden Dome, so on and so forth. But the scope of that is still pretty unclear.
Do you know how this intersects with moving folks to schedule policy career? Are those two Venn diagrams aligned?
That's another thing we don't know. That's a question that Jenny Mattingly at Partnership for Public Service raised. She said we're seeing more and more jobs pop up on USA Jobs that say schedule PC. Is that is that in the purview of these hiring committees to, change jobs to Schedule PC as they're going through the process? Are Schedule PC folks vetted by them? What does that look like? So, that's another thing that I'm going to keep trying to figure out.
Well, these seem to be part of the hiring landscape for the near future, at least. What will you be watching to see how all of this plays out?
Yeah, so I want to see more transparency around workload and their outcomes. How many positions are being reviewed, how quickly, how many are rejected, and, for what reasons? And are these critical positions actually being filled faster and by people, with the right qualifications? A question that I have is for positions in critical areas like shipbuilding, right? Or, anywhere else that has vacancies. Are there jobs that are still sitting empty because a hiring committee said, well, we don't really like something Bob did, a couple months ago, or, what have you, are they prioritizing hiring for certain positions that the administration is placing higher importance on, but aren't necessarily what DoD sees as critical? So, how does that actually affect getting people in the jobs that need to be filled?
And does DoD have a plan to provide that level of transparency?
Not as far as, not that they've given me so far, but, I encourage them to do it at some point.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for this update. Really important news.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.